I was sipping my morning coffee when the sound of machinery tore through the peaceful stillness of Cedar Hollow, Oregon. A cup warm in my hand, I stood frozen amid the familiar birdsong around Spring Creek, the stream running through my 5 acres. I'd lived here for 20 years, treating it as sacred ground, but now what? I rushed outside, still in slippers, too rattled to grab a jacket despite the biting autumn wind. Right away I saw them, a group in green polo shirts and hard hats, lugging surveying gear and clipboards, standing on my land. A blonde woman, hair tightly bunned, turned to face me. She wore an expensive cream suit, her ridiculous white shoes stark against the wet grass. "Good morning, Mr. Carver," she said, her smile not reaching her eyes. "I'm Margaret Pierce, the new HOA president of Cedar Hollow Estates." She extended a hand, but I crossed my arms, ignoring it. "What do you think you're doing?" I growled. Margaret gave an awkward laugh. "We're surveying community water resources. Your creek's an untapped asset that could benefit everyone." I glared. "This is my land, my water." She pulled out a tablet, pointing to a document. "Per Section 12, Clause 7 of the HOA bylaws you signed when you bought the property, resources within community boundaries can be utilized for collective projects. Your creek flows 90 gallons a minute, a single home only needs 30, you've got plenty to spare." I squinted at the fine print I'd long overlooked, blood rushing to my head. "I never approved any survey," Margaret shrugged, her tone icy. "It's perfectly legal. We'll build a small hydroelectric plant, pretty for the park, clean for power, starts Monday." She turned away, her crew trailing like ducklings, leaving me standing there, fists clenched. Did they think I'd just roll over? They were wrong. As Margaret and her lackeys disappeared beyond the pines, I stood there, breath heaving in Cedar Hollow's cold air. My fists tightened until my nails dug into my palms. "Plenty to spare," her words echoed, a slap in the face. I stormed back inside, resolved not to let this slide. If they wanted to play by rules, I'd play too. I rummaged through the old filing cabinet in my study, pulling out the land purchase papers from 20 years ago. The HOA bylaws, thick with convoluted legalese, had sat untouched in a drawer since I moved in. I flipped to Section 12, Clause 7, just as Margaret said. There it was. Natural resources within community boundaries may be harnessed for collective benefit, but what were community boundaries? Spring Creek sat entirely on my land, or so I thought. I needed to be sure. That afternoon, I drove to the county office in downtown Cedar Hollow, demanding copies of my property records and boundary maps. The clerk handed me a stack, and I sat in a corner, poring over every line. My heart sank at a small note: Spring Creek area, designated as community green space, rezoned last month. Rezoned? I'd never gotten notice. I asked the clerk. She shrugged. "Notices come from the HOA, not us. They held a meeting and voted." I drove home, mind reeling. They'd quietly shifted boundaries without telling me? This wasn't random. I fired up my laptop, searching Cedar Hollow Estates HOA, and Margaret Pierce. A local article popped up. Margaret had been elected HOA president 3 months ago, after a campaign promising clean energy and low fees. But what chilled me was a single line. Her husband, Charles Pierce, owned Horizon Builders, a major Oregon construction firm. Digging deeper, I found Horizon had just applied for permits to build 3 upscale housing developments nearby, needing massive water supplies. Suddenly it clicked. Spring Creek wasn't just a community project, it was the first step to controlling water for a bigger scheme. That night, an email from the HOA arrived, making it official. The Cedar Hollow Community Improvement Project begins Monday, installing water diversion equipment, a small reservoir, and a hydroelectric turbine in the Spring Creek area. Minimal disruption, completed in 6 weeks. I called the HOA office immediately, but got voicemail. Margaret's number went straight to messages too. I slammed the table, furious. They weren't just taking my water, they'd turned my backyard into a construction zone. I stepped outside, standing by Spring Creek under the moonlight. The water flowed smoothly, reflecting silver light. This was where Lily and I used to sit, dreaming of a quiet life. Now that peace was threatened by greedy suits, I recalled Margaret's words, clean power and a nice water feature for the community park, but I didn't buy it. If it was just for the community, why the rush? Why no open meeting? I went back inside, snapping photos of the creek and surrounding land, proof of its original state. If they wanted a fight, I'd be ready. I texted Paul Grayson, my next-door neighbor, "Know anything about the HOA project?" Paul replied instantly. "Sounds cool, cheaper power, who wouldn't want that?" I sighed. Paul didn't see the issue, but I did. Margaret and Horizon Builders were playing a big game, and I wouldn't let them win easily. Come Monday, they'd find I wasn't a pushover. I stood by Spring Creek, moonlight dancing on the water, its steady trickle whispering through Cedar Hollow's night. After the HOA email and Paul's carefree text, I couldn't stay indoors. I needed space to think, to breathe. But as I touched the massive oak growing by the creek, Lily's oak, everything flooded back, unstoppable. Lily and I used to sit here for hours under its shady branches, listening to the water and planning our future. 5 years ago, when she was still alive, we bought this land for Spring Creek. "It's like our little secret," she'd said, eyes sparkling as she dipped her feet in the cool flow. "We dreamed of a small house by the creek, a garden, even a little wooden bridge for the kids we never got to have." Lily loved nature more than anyone I'd ever known. She planted wild flowers along the banks, tending each one like her own child. Then cancer came, taking her in just a year. Before she passed, she told me, "Keep Spring Creek, Ethan, don't let it go." I scattered her ashes under this oak as she wanted, so she'd stay forever in the place she loved most. Since then, the creek wasn't just water, it was Lily, memories, a promise I'd sworn to myself. Every time I heard it flow, I heard her laugh. Now Margaret Pierce and her HOA cronies wanted to steal it, turn it into turbines and a reservoir. I gripped the oak's bark, its roughness grounding me. They didn't know what Spring Creek meant to me, not some community resource, like their papers claimed, but the heart of this land of me. I pictured bulldozers ripping up the banks, turbines buzzing over the water's sound, Lily's ashes trampled under workers' boots. My blood boiled. I turned back to the shimmering stream. It flowed 90 gallons a minute. Margaret was right, but that wasn't reason enough to take it. I'd lived off this creek, my well, my vegetable garden, all depended on it. The ecosystem did too. Deer drank here every evening, birds nested in the trees. If they built their plant, it'd all vanish. And Lily, she'd be lost again. I took a deep breath, the night air sharp in my lungs. This wasn't just a fight for land, it was for Lily, for the promise I'd kept these 5 years. Margaret thought I'd let them steamroll me because I lived alone, a widower no one noticed. She was wrong. I pulled out my phone, snapping more photos of the creek and oak in the dark. This was my evidence, my starting point. They wanted Spring Creek, they'd have to go through me first. I walked back to the house, resolve burning with every step. Margaret and Horizon Builders might have money and power, but I had something they didn't understand. This land was my lifeblood, and I'd protect it, whatever it took. I stepped inside after photographing Spring Creek, my mind still churning with images of Lily's oak and Margaret Pierce's threat. My phone buzzed, a text from Paul Grayson, "Heard the HOA will lower monthly fees once the plant's running." Pretty sweet. I sighed, setting it down. Paul, my closest neighbor beyond a wooden fence, clearly didn't grasp what was happening. I needed to know what others thought, so I decided to ask around Cedar Hollow Estates the next morning. Early, I knocked on Paul's door. He opened it, wearing an old tea, coffee in hand. "Hey Ethan, why the tense face?" he grinned, waving me in. I cut to the chase. "Paul, you really think the HOA project's fine? They're taking my creek to build a plant." Paul shrugged, plopping onto his sofa. "Heard Margaret explain it. Clean power, lower fees, who wouldn't want that? Your creek's got tons of water, what's wrong with sharing a bit?" I gritted my teeth. "It's my land, Paul, they didn't ask me, just decided." He nodded, but his eyes slid away. "I get it, but she said you'd still have water flowing through, just using the excess. Benefits the community." I left Paul's, feeling like I'd punched air. He didn't see the problem, or didn't want to. I moved on to Clara Hensley's, 3 houses down. Clara, a retired judge living alone with an old cat, was known for being tough but fair. I knocked and she opened the door, sharp eyes peering over her glasses. "Ethan Carver," she said, voice low, "I'm guessing you're here about the creek." I nodded, quickly recounting Margaret the HOA bylaws and the secret rezoning. Clara crossed her arms, frowning. "I didn't get any notice of a meeting or vote. If they did this without transparency, something's fishy. I'll help you look into it." I exhaled, finally finding an ally. Clara invited me in, brewed tea, and pulled out old files from her judging days. "The HOA here's tried stunts before fining folks for planting unapproved trees, but this is bigger. Got any evidence yet?" I showed her the creek photos and HOA email. Clara nodded. "Good. Keep everything you've got, we'll need it." On my way home, I stopped by Sarah Nguyen's, a single mom with 2 young kids. Sarah opened the door, eyes wary. "I heard you talking to Paul this morning," she whispered. "I don't like this, but I can't speak up. Last year, the HOA fined me $500 because my kid drew chalk on the sidewalk. I can't afford to fight them." I tried persuading her, if enough people object, they'd have to stop. Sarah shook her head. "You don't get it, Margaret's connected everywhere." "I don't want trouble." I got home, sat at the kitchen table, feeling like Cedar Hollow was splitting in 2. Paul, with his easy grin, was sold on promises of low fees. Sarah, though unhappy, was too scared to act. Only Clara stood with me, but what could 2 people do against an HOA board? I opened my laptop, double-checking Horizon Builders info. An old article mentioned Charles Pierce, Margaret's husband, once investigated for permit fraud, but it fizzled out. They weren't just greedy, they knew how to cover tracks. I glanced out the window, seeing the familiar deer drinking by the creek. If Margaret won, they'd have nowhere to go. I remembered Lily's words, "Keep Spring Creek." Clara was right, I needed evidence, and more, a plan. Paul and Sarah might not help, but I wouldn't quit. Margaret wanted to turn my land into their profit. I'd show them the cost of messing with what's mine. I sat in the kitchen, the yellow lamplight spilling over my laptop screen, eyes glued to the article on Charles Pierce and Horizon Builders. After leaving Sarah's, I knew I couldn't just rely on Clara or hope neighbors would come around. Paul had picked self-interest, Sarah was too afraid. I needed to understand my enemy. The old article was a start. Charles had been probed for faking construction permits in Portland, but it lacked evidence and died. I smirked. Money and connections were clearly their weapons, but this time, I wouldn't let them off easy. I typed Horizon Builders Oregon into the search bar, and results flooded in. A local real estate site listed 3 new upscale developments in Oregon's outskirts: Pinewood Heights, Silver Lake Estates, and Crestview Ridge. Each boasted luxury living near nature, with pools, golf courses, and unique water features. I frowned. Those needed water, lots of it. Another post from last week said Horizon had applied for rights to natural water sources in the area. Suddenly, the pieces fit. Spring Creek wasn't just a minor HOA project, it was a test run to secure water for Charles' housing plans. I reopened the HOA email, reading every line closely. "The Cedar Hollow Community Improvement Project begins Monday, installing water diversion equipment, a small reservoir, and a hydroelectric turbine." They called it minimal disruption, but I knew better. If they controlled Spring Creek, they could drain it, wreck the ecosystem, and use my land as a launchpad for something bigger. I dug more on Margaret Pierce. An old Cedar Hollow Times interview revealed she'd been a project manager at Horizon before shifting to community service as HOA president. Community service, I scoffed. This was serving her husband's wallet. I stood, pacing the kitchen. If Horizon succeeded here, they'd have a precedent to take water from anyone in Cedar Hollow, or anywhere in Oregon. I recalled Clara's words, "Something's fishy." She was right. This wasn't just about clean power or low fees, it was a cover for greed. I pulled up the boundary map from the county, rechecking the rezoned area. Spring Creek sat squarely on my land, but the community green space note was added without my signature or notice. They'd deliberately hidden it, banking on everyone's apathy to slip it through. I texted Clara, found more on Horizon Builders. They're using my creek for upscale housing projects. Need to meet. Clara replied instantly, tomorrow, 8 a.m., my place. Bring everything. I nodded at the screen, feeling a leverage point emerge. But I knew time was tight, just 3 days until Monday, when they'd break ground on my land. I had to move fast. I stepped into the backyard, standing by Spring Creek in the dark. Wind carried the scent of pine and damp earth. I thought of Lily, her promise, don't let it go. If Margaret and Charles won, I wouldn't just lose the creek, Cedar Hollow could lose control of its water entirely. I remembered Paul's words, what's wrong with sharing a bit? He didn't get it, this wasn't sharing, it was theft. I stared at the glinting water, resolve hardening like stone. They wanted to turn my creek into cash. I'd make them pay. I went back inside, grabbing paper and pen to jot down what I'd found. Horizon Builders upscale housing projects, Margaret's old roll, and the shady rezoning. I photographed the county docs, saved every article in a folder. Clara would help me dissect it, but I needed more, a way to stop them. I glanced at the clock, nearly midnight. Monday loomed, and I had to be ready. Margaret thought I'd stay quiet because I lived alone. She was about to see what I could do when backed into a corner. I shut the laptop after saving all the evidence on Horizon Builders, my mind still tangled with what I'd uncovered. It was nearly midnight in Cedar Hollow, but I couldn't sleep. Spring Creek was under threat, and I had just 3 days before Margaret Pierce's bulldozers tore up my land. Clara was my only ally now, but I needed more support. I thought of Rachel, my sister, living in Seattle, over 200 miles away. If anyone understood me, it'd be her. I grabbed my phone and dialed. Rachel picked up after a few rings, voice groggy. Ethan, it's almost 1 a.m. What's wrong? I took a deep breath, spilling it all, Margaret, the HOA Horizon Builders, and their plan to take Spring Creek for luxury developments. They're building a hydro plant on my land, Rachel. No consent, no notice, just taking it. This isn't just a creek, it's Lily's legacy. Silence, then a sigh. Look, I get how much it means to you. But are you sure you can't negotiate? If they cut fees or pay you, it might be less hassle than fighting the whole crew. I gripped the phone tighter, disappointment surging. Negotiate, don't you see, they're stealing it outright. If they win, they'll take water from everywhere, not just me. Rachel cut in, softer. Ethan, you're too wound up. The HOA's got power, connections, how can you win? Think practically. I hung up after a few more words, not wanting to argue. Rachel didn't get it, or didn't want to. Spring Creek wasn't something to negotiate, I'd just lost another potential ally. The next morning, I drove around Cedar Hollow, hunting for a lawyer. I hit 3 small offices in town. That and my property docs, and the HOA email. The first, an old man with silver hair, shook his head after 5 minutes. The HOA's strong here, Carver. I won't take it too messy. The second, a middle-aged woman, was blunter. Margaret Pierce, her husband golfs with the county judge. I'm not touching this. The third didn't even let me finish, just said sorry I'm swamped. I left the last office empty-handed, feeling like the whole town was bought or silenced. I pulled over, staring through the windshield. Gray clouds rolled in, hinting at a storm coming soon. I thought of Paul, grinning about lower fees. Sarah too scared to speak, and now Rachel, my own sister, turning away. Clara was my only lifeline, but what could 2 of us do against a system? I slammed the steering wheel, anger and helplessness mixing. They thought I was an easy target, because I was alone. Maybe they were right about numbers, but they were wrong about my will. I drove home, mind circling back to Spring Creek. If no one would help, I'd do it myself. I had photos, documents, and proof on Horizon Builders, enough for Clara to analyze. But the law moved slow, and Monday was close. I thought of Lily's oak, the promise I'd kept for 5 years. Margaret and Charles might have money and ties, but I had something they didn't expect: this land, and I knew it better than anyone. I'd studied some hydrology in college, not much, but enough to understand flow and pressure. I stepped inside, reopening the boundary map. Spring Creek was mine, no matter the green space label they slapped on. I'd meet Clara tomorrow, but an idea was sparking. If the law couldn't stop them in time, the land itself might. I glanced at the creek through the window, isolation fading, replaced by a smoldering fire. They wanted to play. I'd play my way. I woke before dawn, mind still heavy from the call with Rachel and the slammed doors from lawyers. Cedar Hollow was quiet, just the wind whistling through the pines outside. I brewed coffee, deciding not to wait for the 8 a.m. meeting with Clara to start. If no one would help, I'd find a way myself. I opened my laptop, pulling up the HOA's water system design I'd grabbed from the county office via a Freedom of Information request yesterday. I'd studied some hydrology in college. Not enough to be an engineer, but enough for basics. This was my shot to see what Margaret and Horizon Builders were really up to. The design was dense with lines and figures, but I zeroed in on Spring Creek's part. They planned a small reservoir, a turbine system, and an automated flow valve to manage water pressure. I traced the pipes on the schematic. They ran from my creek down to Pine Ridge Lane, the ritzy neighborhood where Margaret and 6 other HOA board members lived. I frowned. If this system failed, water would flood straight there, nowhere else. The thought stopped me. Could I turn their mistake into my advantage? I zoomed in on the control valve. It was an automated type, adjusting based on pressure, pretty modern, but not flawless. I recalled an old lecture in high pressure, like heavy rain. These valves sometimes fail open instead of shut, dumping the entire flow outward. I checked the technical notes. The pipes they used were residential grade, not industrial. With Spring Creek's 90 gallons per minute, plus heavy rain, the pressure could exceed limits. I grinned. They'd built a water bomb, and I could be the one to light the fuse, but I needed to be sure. I grabbed my property map, comparing it to the HOA schematic. Their overflow route ran straight to Pine Ridge Lane, with no secondary channel to relieve pressure. If I boosted the flow from my land, like funneling extra rainwater into the creek, the system would overload. I glanced out the window. Gray skies, a storm forecast nearing. An idea was taking shape, but I needed more info about my own land. I drove to Clara's at 8 a.m., bringing my laptop and papers. She opened the door, her old cat slinking around her feet. "You look like you struck gold," she said, leading me to the kitchen. I spread the design on the table, pointing out the valve and pipe weaknesses. If pressure spikes, water floods Pine Ridge Lane, Margaret's and the board's homes. They miscalculated groundwater levels. Clara slid her glasses up, studying it. Smart. But how do you ramp up pressure without breaking the law? I didn't have a full answer yet, but I knew I was on the right track. On the way home, I stopped by Edith Kimura's, 87 years old, living at the road's end, here longer than anyone. I'd fixed her roof after a storm once, so she was always warm to me. I knocked, and she answered, eyes bright behind thick glasses. "Ethan, come in. I bet it's about the creek." I nodded, briefly explaining Margaret and the HOA's plan. Edith snorted. "Those vultures. Last year, they made me remove a peach tree for non-compliance. I kept it anyway." I asked about the terrain around Spring Creek, anything that could help. Edith pondered, then stood, pulling an old rusted iron key from a drawer. "This unlocks the old drainage tunnel," she whispered. "My husband built them in the 50s, before Cedar Hollow was a neighborhood. They run under the whole area, from your land to Pine Ridge Lane's edge. The entry's behind the big rock, east of your property." I took the key, stunned. "Why didn't you say sooner?" Edith winked. "I waited for you to ask the right question." I raced home, finding the big rock Edith mentioned. It was hidden by bushes, shoulder high. I shoved it aside, revealing a metal hatch, locked tight. Edith's key fit perfectly, and I opened it. Inside was pitch black, the smell of damp earth hitting me. I flicked on my phone's flashlight, stepping down. The tunnel was about 3 feet wide, stone walls moss-covered, but sturdy. I walked along, spotting water seeping from the ceiling, proof it tied to Spring Creek's aquifer. If I opened this during heavy rain, it'd draw more water, multiplying the pressure on the HOA's system. I climbed out, mind racing with possibilities. Weak valve, cheap pipes, and now an old tunnel. I had everything to turn Margaret's plan into their disaster. I checked the forecast, a big storm in 3 days, hitting Monday, when they'd break ground. I laughed, not sabotage, but letting nature teach them a lesson. I texted Clara, found a way, meet you soon. Margaret thought I was isolated and weak, she'd see Spring Creek's real power. I woke to faint light seeping through the curtains, mind still buzzing from the tunnel discovery and the HOA system's flaws. Just 2 days until Monday, when Margaret Pierce and her crew would invade Spring Creek. I texted Clara after brewing coffee, community meeting tonight at the Cedar Hollow Center. Come with me, she replied. Yes, bring papers and the design. I nodded at the screen. If there was a chance to expose their scheme publicly, it was tonight. I spent the day reviewing evidence, the design with its weak valve, shady rezoning notes, Horizon Builders articles, and Spring Creek photos. I printed copies, stuffed them in a briefcase, determined not to let Margaret steamroll me. As the sun set, I drove to the community center, a low building, with a red-tiled roof. Clara waited at the door, clutching old papers, eyes sharp. "Ready, Ethan?" she asked. I nodded, though my heart pounded. Inside, about 50 people sat on plastic chairs, murmuring. Margaret stood at the podium, in a bold red blazer, her professional smile plastered on. Charles Pierce sat up front, phone in hand, eyes on the screen. I recognized faces, Paul Grayson, Sarah Nguyen, and neighbors who'd brushed me off. Margaret tapped the mic, starting. "Good evening, everyone. Tonight, we discuss the Cedar Hollow Community Improvement Project, a small hydro plant using Spring Creek for clean power and lower monthly fees." I stood immediately, not waiting. "I've got a question, Margaret. Why wasn't anyone notified about rezoning my land? Only 40 of 130 households voted. Is that transparency?" The room buzzed. Margaret frowned, but regained composure. "Mr. Carver, all notices followed procedure. Meeting minutes show a majority. 37 yes, 3 no. If you didn't attend, you don't get to complain." Clara rose beside me. "I got no notice. I read all my mail, nothing about this." Margaret forced a smile. "Maybe lost in the mail. Regardless, the project's legally approved." I held up the design. "Approved how, when your system's unsafe? This valve fails in heavy rain, flooding Pine Ridge Lane, your and the board's homes." Murmurs grew louder. Paul piped up. "Ethan, I just got the general newsletter. Thought it was minor." Margaret cut in. "Mr. Carver's spreading baseless panic. We have professional engineers. This is for the community, not a personal issue." I started to retort, but Charles stood, voice deep. "Enough. Project starts Monday. Obstruct it, and face legal consequences." Margaret nodded, ending the meeting. People filed out, some glancing at me with pity, but none spoke up. Paul patted my shoulder. "Sorry, Ethan, but lower fees help everyone." Sarah quietly avoided me. Clara whispered, "They control the crowd too well. We need another way." I got home, fury boiling. They didn't just ignore me, they painted me as a troublemaker. Next morning, a certified letter was taped to my door, a cease and desist from the HOA, barring me from interfering with community improvements, threatening a $10,000 fine if I didn't comply. I tore it up, tossed it on the floor. $10,000, I didn't have that, and they knew it. This was how they cornered me. I stepped into the yard, watching Spring Creek flow calmly in the dim light. They'd start tomorrow, and the law couldn't save me in time. I thought of Lily's Oak, the promise I'd kept. Margaret and Charles could overpower me in a meeting, but they didn't know this land like I did. I checked my phone's forecast, a big storm hitting Monday, heavy rain for 2 days, Edith's old tunnel, the HOA's weak valve, and the storm, all lining up for me. I texted Clara, "They're threatening a $10,000 fine, but I've got a plan. Meet this afternoon?" She replied, "Yes, be careful, Ethan." I looked at the creek, helplessness fading, replaced by cold resolve. They wanted a legal fight? I'd fight with something they couldn't predict, nature itself. Margaret thought I was done? She'd see how dangerous I was with nothing left to lose. I stood in the kitchen, the HOA's crumpled $10,000 threat on the table. After last night's meeting, I knew I had no way back. Margaret and Charles had shut every legal door, but gazing at Spring Creek through the window, I felt the approaching storm wasn't just a threat, but a chance. I needed someone technical, to confirm my plan's feasibility. I thought of Luis Alvarez, old college buddy, now a hydraulic engineer in Portland. 3 years ago, I'd helped him pump floodwater from his garage. After Storm Elaine, he owed me one. I called right away. Luis answered, voice warm and deep. Ethan Carver? Been a while. What's up so early? I laid it out fast, the HOA Spring Creek, the design, and my intent to use the storm to break their system. I need you to check it, see if their valve and pipes are as weak as I think. Luis chuckled. Sounds like your kind of trouble. I'm free this morning. Be there in 2 hours. I exhaled, a flicker of light in the dark. Luis arrived on time, driving a scratched silver truck. He was tall, graying hair, toolbox in hand. Turning your land into a battlefield, huh? He teased, stepping inside. I led him to the kitchen table, spreading out the design. Here, automated flow valve, residential pipes, overflow to Pine Ridge Lane. I think if I spike pressure with rain, it'll fail. Luis studied it, flipping pages, then whistled. You're right, these pipes can't handle Spring Creek's 90 gallons per minute, let alone heavy rain. The valve's worse, prone to failing open under overload. If it floods, it's straight to the board's neighborhood. I pointed out Edith Kimura's old tunnel. Found this under my land. If I open it during the storm, groundwater boosts pressure more. Luis frowned, but his eyes lit up. Clever. Old tunnels often tap aquifers. It could double the flow. But careful, if you don't control it, it'll flood everything, not just Pine Ridge. I nodded. I only want them hit, no one else. We went outside, checking in person. I led Luis to the hatch behind the big rock. He crouched, shining his flashlight in. Still usable, but partly clogged. Open it right, and water pours like a falls. I grinned, first time in days, so I've got a weapon. Luis clapped my shoulder. You do. But remember, this isn't sabotage, it's them reaping what they sowed. Don't let them catch you out. I rechecked the forecast, storm hitting Monday night, their groundbreaking day, with peak rain over 2 days. I looked at Luis. If I funnel roof and yard runoff into the creek, plus the tunnel, they won't hold. He nodded. Exactly. But keep it legal, rerouting drainage on your lands. You're right. I agreed, the plan solidifying. I spent the afternoon reshaping the yard. I grabbed a hoe and shovel from the shed, digging small trenches from the roof to the creek, just routine drainage improvement, nothing they could fault. I tested the tunnel again, ensuring the hatch opened smoothly when needed. Sweat poured, but I didn't stop. Each dig was a strike at Margaret and Charles. I pictured rain pouring, mixing with Spring Creek and groundwater, turning their system to rubble. Luis stayed till evening, helping, then clapped my shoulder before leaving. Good luck, Ethan. Call if you need me. I nodded, thanking him. As his truck faded, I stood by the creek, watching it gleam under moonlight. The storm neared. I felt it in the humid air and rising wind. Margaret thought I was out of moves. She didn't know how ready I was. I woke at dawn, body sore from digging trenches and checking the tunnel with Luis. Cedar Hollow was still quiet, but the air hung heavy, damp, the storm closing in. Today was Sunday, the last day before Margaret and the HOA started on Spring Creek. I brewed coffee, eyeing the yard. The new drainage trenches looked normal, no one suspecting they were my weapon. But opening my phone to check the forecast, heavy rain starting tonight, I felt unease rise. I had to ensure everything was set. I stepped out, planning to recheck the hatch, when I saw Paul Grayson by the wooden fence between our homes. He waved, smile strained. Hey, Ethan, got a sec? I frowned, walking over. Paul shoved his hands in his pockets, voice hesitant. I've been thinking about this. Maybe you should compromise with the HOA. Project's nearly done, fighting's just wasted effort. I clenched my jaw. Compromise? They're stealing my land, Paul. That creek's not for selling power. He shrugged. But it's just sitting there, now the whole area benefits. I don't want you suffering more. I was about to reply when a sleek black SUV rolled by, stopping at my house. Margaret Pierce stepped out, still in pricey gear, flanked by 2 men in suits. I turned to Paul, his eyes dodging mine. What'd you tell them? I growled. Paul mumbled. Just said you were stressed, they asked. Ice hit me, he'd sold me out. Margaret strode up, smile triumphant. Mr. Carver, I hear you're still not giving up. Save your energy. We start tomorrow morning. I crossed my arms. You've got no right to take my creek. She held up papers. We've got every right, and if you interfere, that $10,000 fine's just the start. A suit stepped forward, handing me an envelope. Official notice from Horizon Builders. We're installing bigger pipes today to prep. Don't make trouble. I tore it open, seeing an order barring me from the creek area, on my own land. Margaret turned away, but I shouted after her, "You'll regret touching Spring Creek." She smirked, not looking back. I glanced at Paul. He hung his head. "Sorry, Ethan, they promised me an extra fee cut." I stormed inside, saying nothing more. Paul's betrayal stung like a knife, but it didn't shock me. He always took the easy route. Now I knew I was truly alone, save for Clara and Luis. I called Clara immediately. Paul ratted me out to Margaret. "They're speeding up, installing bigger pipes today." Clara sighed over the line. "I feared as much. I'm checking laws. Everything you do must be legal. Don't let them sue you." I nodded, though she couldn't see. "I've got the storm, Clara. It's the one thing they can't control." She paused. "Be careful, Ethan. Meet me if you need to." That afternoon, I saw Horizon Builders trucks arrive, hauling giant metal pipes. Workers started digging near Spring Creek, just meters from Lily's Oak. I stood at the window, fists tight. They weren't just taking water, they were wrecking my memories. A worker snapped an oak branch by mistake, and I nearly charged out, but held back. Not yet. I checked the forecast again, rain starting in hours, intensifying by morning. Time was ticking. I went to the yard as dark fell, black clouds swirling overhead. I checked the drainage trenches, ready to funnel rain into the creek. I knelt by the hatch, testing Edith's key. It still opened smooth. Wind picked up, carrying moisture. I looked at Spring Creek, flowing peacefully one last time before the storm. Margaret thought I was finished. She didn't know I'd turned my land into a weapon. I went inside, heart heavy but blazing. Paul betrayed me. The HOA threatened me. Horizon boxed me in. But I had the storm, the tunnel, and a will they'd never grasp. Tomorrow, they'd come with bulldozers. I'd meet them with something they couldn't predict. This wasn't their game anymore, it was mine. I stood by the window as the first raindrops fell, drumming the glass like a war beat. Sunday night in Cedar Hollow had gone pitch black, thick clouds blotting out the moon. The forecast was spot on. The storm hit early, and I knew it'd be fiercer than expected. I gazed at Spring Creek through the downpour, its flow still calm, but not for long. Margaret and Horizon Builders would start this morning, but I was ready to fight, not with laws, but with the land itself. Rain thickened, wind howling through the pines, activating the drainage trenches I'd dug. Water from the roof and yard streamed down, feeding straight into the creek as planned. I threw on a raincoat, grabbed a flashlight, and stepped out for a final check. Mud squished underfoot, the water's roar growing. I knelt by Edith's old hatch, key in hand. I didn't open it, not yet. I wanted the HOA's system to take Spring Creek's pressure first, then I'd hit them with the knockout. By midnight, rain came in torrents, wind gusting so hard, Lily's Oak trembled. I heard machinery faintly. They'd come early, weather be damned. Peering through the storm, I saw headlights from Horizon Builders trucks near the creek. Workers were installing the big pipes, a small turbine already by the bank. They rushed, likely aiming to finish before the storm worsened. I grinned coldly. They were digging their own grave. I called Clara, voice cutting through the rain. "They're setting up now, storm's picking up. I think the system won't hold." Clara yelled back, "Don't do anything stupid, Ethan. Record everything, we need proof." I nodded, filming with my phone through the window. Rain pounding, workers struggling, Spring Creek rising. My trenches worked perfectly, runoff merging with the creek, doubling its flow. By 3 a.m., the storm peaked. Water slammed the roof like 1,000 hammers, the street a small river. I heard metal groan from the creek, the first sign. I ran out, flashlight piercing the rain. The turbine buzzed wildly, red lights flashing on the control station. Workers had bailed, leaving it running solo. I knew their weak valve was under insane pressure, 90 gallons per minute from the creek, plus my runoff, but I wasn't satisfied. I slogged through mud to the hatch, unlocking it with Edith's key. The door creaked, groundwater gushing out, joining Spring Creek. I kept filming, capturing the flow surge. A sharp ping rang from the control station. The first joint gave, then a second, a third. Alarms blared, red lights strobing. I laughed loud in the rain. Their system was crumbling. I ran up the hill for a full view. A loud metal groan echoed, and the main valve failed open, just as Luis predicted. Water burst out, not through a side channel, but straight to Pine Ridge Lane. I watched it roar, carrying mud and debris, barreling toward Margaret's and the Board's homes. No other houses were in its path, just them. I called 911 instantly. "This is Ethan Carver, 1487 Hillside Road. The HOA's water plant collapsed. Floods hitting Pine Ridge Lane. Send help fast." I hung up, not wanting anyone hurt, but unable to stop the grin. I waded to the road, seeing Margaret's black SUV speed up from Pine Ridge Lane. She stopped, stepped out in the rain, face pale. "What the hell did you do?" she screamed, spotting me. I stayed calm. "I warned you, my creek couldn't handle your shoddy system. This is the result." Margaret shook, not from cold. "This is sabotage. I'll sue you." I shook my head. "I just rerouted rain on my land. Fully legal. Your engineers screwed up, not me." I returned to the hill, watching water flood through the Board's neighborhood. Margaret's house was submerged to the windows, her prized flower garden, a muddy ruin. 6 other homes shared the same fate, only the Board members, no one else. I heard sirens in the distance, blue and red lights flashing. I filmed more video, capturing the chaos, workers fleeing, the turbine silenced, and the small reservoir cracking apart. The system they built didn't just fail, it self-destructed. I stood there, rain lashing my face, feeling both satisfied and empty. They'd pushed me to the edge, and I'd fought back with the power I knew best. Spring Creek. Margaret thought I was weak. Now she knew what I could do when cornered. I trudged home, soaked but not cold. The storm still raged, but I'd won, not with laws, but with my land and water. Inside, rain still roared outside the window, but victory overshadowed everything. Spring Creek had done exactly what I'd hoped. The HOA's system shattered, water flooded Pine Ridge Lane, and Margaret Pierce finally tasted defeat. I peeled off my drenched raincoat, sat with a hot coffee, and reviewed last night's footage. The turbine roaring then dying, water sweeping the Board's homes, and Margaret's panicked face. This was my proof, not just for pride, but to protect myself. Early morning, my phone rang. "Clara, Ethan, you okay?" I heard rescue reported flooding at Pine Ridge Lane. I recounted it fast. The storm drainage trenches, old tunnel, and how the HOA's system collapsed on itself. I didn't sabotage, just rerouted rain on my land. They couldn't handle the pressure. Clara chuckled. "Clever. I've got something for you. County papers, showing they never approved diverting Spring Creek's water. I'll bring them over now." I nodded into the phone, relieved. Clara was always a rock. She arrived by lunchtime, toting a thick file. "Here," she pointed to a rejected permit from last year. They applied, but the county denied it for lacking an environmental assessment. Margaret and Charles went rogue. I scanned it, spotting forged signatures on some pages, clear evidence. "More," Clara said. I called an old EPA friend. "They're coming next week to check machine oil and erosion pollution around the creek." I laughed loud. "They're done for." That afternoon, I heard sirens outside. Stepping out, I saw 2 black SUVs parked at Margaret's FBI agents, unmistakable. She stood in her yard, wet coat on, yelling into her phone, as 2 men in gray suits escorted her to a car. I filmed from a distance, catching snippets through the rain. "I didn't do anything wrong, it's a conspiracy." An agent raised handcuffs, and she went silent, face ashen. I called Clara instantly. "FBI just nabbed Margaret." "What's happening?" She replied, "I'd guess fraud and embezzlement. You stirred up a big mess for them." That night, local news exploded. Cedar Hollow Estates HOA president, arrested on charges of racketeering, community fund embezzlement, and abuse of power. They showed Margaret's mud-swamped house, the broken turbine system, and a reporter saying an illegal hydro project caused tens of thousands in damage to Pine Ridge Lane. I laughed. Not illegal, but their own consequence. My videos were gold now, proving I hadn't lifted a finger. Next day, I went to the county courthouse with Clara. We filed a formal objection, attaching evidence, fake permits, storm footage and EPA pollution docs. The judge, not Charles's golf buddy, reviewed it fast. No valid permit, this project's void, he ruled. Mr. Carver retains Spring Creek ownership. HOA must compensate damages. I exhaled, glancing at Clara. She patted my shoulder. You did it. The HOA board dissolved soon after. An emergency meeting Tuesday night at the community center saw people booing as the 6 remaining members stood at the podium. We resign effective immediately, one stammered, face flushed. All residents affected by the flood will be compensated. Applause erupted, but I knew they had no choice. FBI was in, and HOA accounts were frozen for investigation. Paul Grayson sat in a corner, avoiding my eyes. Sarah Nguyen approached, whispering, "Thanks, Ethan. I was wrong not to help." I went home, standing by Spring Creek. The water still flowed, murkier from storm mud. I thought of Lily, the promise I'd kept. Margaret and Charles lost, not just the project, but their reputation and power. That night's news confirmed. Charles summoned over Horizon Builders ties, and EPA found turbine oil leaked into the creek, breaching 7 environmental regs. They didn't just fall, they were ruined. I texted Luis, "You were right, systems toast." "Thanks," he replied. "Congrats, warrior. Celebrate with a drink." I smiled, relief spreading. Margaret thought I was weak living alone, but I had Spring Creek, Clara, and Luis enough to beat her. Now she knew, don't touch what isn't yours. I stood by Spring Creek the morning after the HOA board dissolved, breath fogging in Cedar Hollow's cold air. The water flowed, still cloudy post-storm, but it was mine. No one could take it now. Margaret and Charles were down, FBI digging into Horizon Builders, and the community finally awake. But I didn't want to stop at winning. I wanted this land to become something bigger, not just for me, but for all. I recalled Lily's words, "Keep Spring Creek." Now I'd do more. I'd protect it forever. I called Clara after breakfast. "I want to turn Spring Creek into a community nature preserve, free access, no more exploitation. What do you think?" Clara laughed over the phone. "Great idea, Ethan. I know a nonprofit in Portland, Green Haven. They specialize in conserving private land. I'll set it up." I nodded, feeling a new path open. I didn't just want to keep the creek, I wanted it to endure. Days later, a Green Haven rep arrived. Jenna, short hair, eager voice. I led her to Spring Creek, showing Lily's oak and recounting the fight. "I want this safe from people like Margaret," I said. Jenna nodded. "We can help. If you dedicate the land as a preserve, we'll provide legal aid, funding and upkeep. It'll be protected permanently." I agreed instantly, no hesitation. It's what Lily would have wanted. I started detailed planning. I sketched a preserve map at the kitchen table, trails along the creek, info signs on the ecosystem, and a small spot under the oak to honor Lily. Green Haven sent surveyors, confirming Spring Creek supported dozens of bird, deer and fish species, a system worth saving. They helped me file with the county, and in 2 weeks, Spring Creek Nature Preserve was officially approved. I smiled signing the papers, first real relief in a month. I held the first tree planting day that weekend. I called around Cedar Hollow, inviting folks, no pressure, just hope. Clara arrived early, with a shovel and homemade cookies. Sarah Nguyen brought her 2 kids, less fear in her eyes. "I want to help," she said. "You were right about everything." I nodded, letting the past go. Over 30 people showed, even some who'd stayed silent at the HOA meeting. We planted wildflowers along the banks, laid stones for paths, and set up a wooden sign, "Spring Creek Nature's and the community's asset." Most surprising was Rachel, my sister, stepping out of her car. She wore a thick coat, garden tools in hand. "Rachel?" I asked, shocked. She smiled awkwardly. "Heard the news you won big. I was wrong to tell you to give up. Let me help." I hugged her, saying little. We planted a shrub by the creek together, and for the first time in years, my family felt whole again. Green Haven brought local elementary kids the next week. I led them around the preserve, telling how the storm and Spring Creek defended itself. A boy asked, "How'd you beat the bad guys?" I laughed. "Not me. the water and land did. They cheered seeing deer drink near the oak, and I knew I'd done right. The preserve wasn't just my win, it was everyone's. Weeks later, I stood by the creek alone, watching the water clear. EPA had cleaned the HOA's turbine oil, and nature was healing. One morning, I saw a blue heron land by the bank, first sign of life returning. I snapped a photo, sent it to Lewis. "Wildlife's back, thanks." He texted, "Mission accomplished, warrior." I sat under Lily's oak, peace spreading. Margaret and Charles were history. She faced criminal charges. He lost Horizon Builders in scandal. The community elected a new HOA board, Clara advising, pledging transparency. I didn't join. I was done with that. Spring Creek was a preserve now, guarded by law, and Green Haven, untouchable. I looked at the water, thinking of Lily. "See?" I whispered. I kept my word. This preserve was her legacy, ours, not just memory, but something alive, breathing with Cedar Hollow. I stood, knowing I'd turned pain into hope, and for the first time in 5 years, I felt whole. I woke early weeks after the planting day, first sunlight and days piercing the curtains, spilling onto Cedar Hollow's wooden floor. Spring Creek was an official preserve now, and I'd grown used to birdsong over machinery. I brewed coffee, stepped outside, seeing the creek sparkle in the sun. The water was clear again, no trace of storm mud or HOA turbine oil. I thought of Margaret and Charles, now ghosts of the past, erased by law and community. But one thing nagged: Paul Grayson. Paul hadn't shown at the planting day, though I'd invited him. His betrayal, tipping Margaret off about my plans, left a mark, not as deep as before. I eyed the wooden fence between our homes, recalling his carefree grin about lower fees. He'd chosen self-interest over standing with me, but I didn't want it lingering forever. I'd won. Spring Creek was safe. Maybe it was time to let go. I decided to visit Paul after breakfast. I knocked, holding a tray of leftover wildflower seeds from the preserve project. He opened the door, rumpled tea, eyes slightly red, probably sleepless. "Ethan?" he said, surprised. I lifted the tray. "Brought these over. Thought you could plant them along the fence, spruce up the preserve." Paul stared at me, then the seeds, hesitating. "Come in," he said, voice low. We sat at his kitchen table, tension thick. Paul broke the silence first. "I'm sorry, Ethan. I shouldn't have told Margaret. They promised lower fees, and I thought you'd lose." I sipped the coffee he poured, keeping calm. "You chose them over me, Paul, but I'm not here to blame. I want to move past this." He bowed his head. "When water hit Pine Ridge Lane, I saw how wrong I was. You saved the creek, and I just watched." I nodded, not replying right away. I didn't need fancy apologies, just that he got it. "Help me plant these seeds?" I asked. Paul looked up, surprised, then gave a small smile. "Sure." We went to his yard, knelt by the fence, digging and sowing under warm sun. Few words, but each shovel seemed to chip at the rift between us. When done, Paul clapped my shoulder. "Thanks for not giving up on the creek or me." I smiled. "Neighbors, right?" That afternoon, I returned to Spring Creek alone, bringing the journal I hadn't opened since Lily's death. I sat under the oak, flipped to a blank page, and wrote, "Today's a new day for the creek and me. Margaret lost, the preserve stands, and Paul's back. Lily, I did it." I wrote about the storm, how water swept away the HOA's greed, and how the community rallied around Spring Creek. Each word lifted a weight from my chest. I looked up at a wingbeat. The blue heron from last week returned, landing by the bank, beak dipping water. I smiled, feeling Lily watching from somewhere. Deer started appearing at dusk, drinking like before Margaret came. The preserve was alive again, not just land, but a home for nature and memories. I closed my eyes, hearing water flow, wind through the oak leaves. For the first time in 5 years, I felt true peace, not from winning but from keeping my promise to Lily. I stood, looking around. Clara texted this morning that the new HOA board elected her advisor, vowing no past mistakes. Rachel called, saying she'd visit the preserve this weekend. Sarah and her kids stopped by often, bringing sweets to thank me. Cedar Hollow wasn't divided anymore, it was healing, like Spring Creek. I needed nothing more: my creek, Lily's memory, and a community that valued it. I walked home as sunset fell, golden light blazing on the water. Paul waved from his yard, our planted seeds ready to sprout. I waved back, knowing all was well. Spring Creek didn't just survive, it triumphed, and so did I. I went inside, leaving the window open, letting the creek's sound lull me to sleep. First time in years without nightmares, just peace. The story: HOA built water power plant on my land, as I have plenty to give, so I flooded their homes, reflects many real facets of life in the US today, especially the tension between individual rights, community good, and the greed of powerful entities. Ethan Carver in Cedar Hollow, Oregon, faces off against the HOA and Horizon builders, who exploit legal loopholes to seize Spring Creek, his private property, for profit from upscale real estate. Margaret Pierce and Charles Pierce embody the abuse of power often seen in local boards or big business in America, masking personal agendas under the guise of community service. Paul Grayson's betrayal mirrors the apathy of many Americans facing injustice, opting for short-term gains like lower fees over fighting for what's right. Meanwhile, Ethan's persistence, backed by Clara Hensley and Luis Alvarez, and his turning the land into a preserve show the strength of individuals, when paired with knowledge and a small but determined community. The takeaway from this tale applies directly to real life in America today. Don't let apathy or pressure from authority obscure your rightful claims. Ethan didn't just rely on the law, twisted by Margaret's connections, but used his hydrology know-how and Edith Kimura's old tunnel to let nature reclaim justice. It's a reminder that in a country valuing individual liberty like the US, you must actively defend your rights, whether it's property, environment, or personal values, like Lily's memory. Learn to gather evidence, like Ethan's videos and papers, find trusty allies Clara Luis, and don't shy from confronting wrongs, even if you feel isolated like Ethan did at first. Finally, his making Spring Creek a community preserve teaches that victory isn't just keeping what's yours, it's building lasting value for all, a very American spirit, both individual and collective. So if you're in the US, and facing a similar bind, like an HOA imposing absurd rules, or a company trampling your rights, act like Ethan. Know your rights, use available resources, law, community, nature, and persist to the end. Don't let short-term ease, like Paul, cost you what matters. Life in America gives you freedom, but demands you fight to keep it. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories of fighting for justice like Spring Creek. Thanks for joining me, and see you in the next video with more surprising wins from our own land. If you loved Ethan's journey defending Spring Creek, hit subscribe so you don't miss out. Thanks for watching, and I'll be back soon with stronger tales from Cedar Hollow.